to date. We start again. Very welcome to everybody to the third day on the BIBFRAME Workshop in Europe 2021. At the first 2 days, we had implementation updates from Library of Congress, National Library of Sweden, and CRVD. And on day 2, we focused on new developments and looking at 2 editors and also on the work together of Zenopia and Folio. There was a presentation about the interest of BIBFRAME in Nigeria, and the 1.0 art and rare materials BIBFRAME ontology was presented. And today, the focus is data exchange, but first we have a presentation about BIBFRAME ontology update. Then we have a panel about what role can RDA, RDF play in the transition to linked library data. And then we have focus on BIBFRAME data exchange, first with a report on the PCC meeting on BIBFRAME data exchange, and then a panel discussion on BIBFRAME data exchange. And I'll just also highlight that please use the Slack channel for day 3 when you have comments and questions. I'll say at you can follow the workshop at Twitter, and you can use Twitter with this hashtag you see here on the screen. And I would also like to announce that ongoing after the workshop, you can follow what happens according to our work on the mailing list. And after this short introduction, I will give the screen to Kevin Ford from Library of Congress, who will talk about the BIBFRAME ontology update. Welcome everybody, and Kevin, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Leif. All right. Well, good afternoon to our European colleagues. Good morning to North American participants. My name is Kevin Ford. I work on BIBFRAME at the Library of Congress in the Network Development and MARC Standards Office. I spoke about this same topic in June during the BIBFRAME update meeting, which is part of the annual American Library Association conference activities. While it is not common to deliver the same presentation or a very similar one at a later conference, we felt that this topic and presentation was worth revisiting for a European audience. The majority of you do not necessarily follow, understandably, events that occur during an American Library conference, but many of you are nevertheless engaged in working with BIBFRAME. In June 2021, we updated the BIBFRAME ontology or vocabulary. The new version, version 2.1, is a major release incorporating a huge number of changes. The ontology is officially hosted at id.loc.gov, but it is maintained in GitHub, where community participants can submit issues, comment, and/or follow any debate and track changes. 50 GitHub issues were resolved for the 2.1 update. The bulk of changes, probably close to 45 or 46 of them, were in 3 categories: domain range changes, inverse property requests, and changes or requests to integrate or align better with other vocabularies. Whenever there was a defined domain and range, the change almost always resulted in eliminating a property's domain and range. However, in many cases, the property had no formal domain or range to begin with. Instead, an unclear usage note caused confusion. For those, we made the documentation clear that the usage note was suggested guidance versus an ontological expectation. Users requested inverse properties in a number of cases to facilitate working with the vocabulary in various software systems. And so we created the inverses. And the Art and Rare Materials group, which was convened as part of the LD4P grant, about which we heard some yesterday, submitted a number of requests related to ways to use the ARM vocabulary with BIBFRAME. More work will doubtless happen with these types of extensions in the future beyond the small changes made in 2.1. As I noted a second ago, the ontology is at id.loc.gov. If interested, changes are marked in red on the page, and all notices of changes link or should link to the related GitHub issue. Finally, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank all of those who were working with BIBFRAME, evaluating the vocabulary, submitting issues, and otherwise engaged in the process. We also want to extend gratitude to those entities and individuals supporting and/or developing BIBFRAME implementations, especially the patient catalogers working with Sinopia and our own editors, kicking the tires in the vocabulary in the MARC. Now, I would like to spend the remainder of my time talking about change in BIBFRAME. There is very much a growing desire by many in the community to formalize the BIBFRAME change process. However, perhaps unintuitively, I want to begin with spending a minute talking about MARC. Not the format, however, instead the process for change in MARC. The process for change in MARC and the stewardship by its stakeholders in the library community have provided stability, created a robust process for vetting changes, and ensured orderly evolution for the last half century. MARC has been nurtured and loved every 6 to 12 months for decades. Change is a reality. You simply do not have a format that remains as important and vibrant as MARC without accepting that it needs to evolve with the times, with the desires of the community. Fields have been added and modified and even deprecated from the MARC formats over time. Subfields have been expanded, reduced, or added to the MARC formats. And MARC has developed unwritten conventions in the absence of clear rules. These changes have been made to MARC because it has been our endless quest over the last half century to make it a more perfect format. To this end, MARC was updated 6 months ago. And it was updated 12 months before that, and 18 months before that, and so on. Changes in MARC are happening because our needs, the needs of our community, change regularly. At LC, we expect BIBFRAME to be the attention of a similar level of devotion and change. As such, it raises the question, who proposes and effects these changes in MARC? In short, we do. We who make up this community. More specifically, it is the MARC Advisory Committee, commonly referred to as MAC. Along with the MARC Steering Group, which has international representation, MAC is a panel of 15 plus voting members, each of which represents a major constituency in the community. Note again the international composition of the voting members, with representatives from the National Library of Spain and the National Library of Australia, in addition to those who are part of the steering committee, all alongside those representing music catalogers, the PCC, ISSN, and OCLC, just to name a few examples. It is important to note that each of these stakeholders has a large-scale implementation in MARC, or represents organizations that do, and as such devote uncommon resources to managing MARC locally. Now, how change happens in MARC. Changes in MARC begin with the discussion paper that describes the problem and the desire of the requesting party, details the limitations in MARC presently, proposes one or more possible solutions to be made, complete with examples, and ends with a series of questions to the wider community about the problem and proposed solution. A discussion paper is discussed at length. Sometimes MAC recommends the discussion paper return the next time MAC meets as a proposal, frequently with a few changes. Or MAC may recommend it is not ready, that the discussion paper needs to be revised and be re-presented to MAC for discussion. Even a proposal is not safe from lengthy discussion and review, though it is nevertheless often voted on, with or without amendments. If a proposal receives a majority of votes, the change is official in MARC in 6 months. If not, the proposers may try again. This adversarial democratic process has been the basis for change in MARC for a couple of decades now. Lest anyone think this isn't work, ask those tasked with putting a discussion paper together and then defending it. There are some doctoral candidates who have probably had better times in their oral exams. In the end, it's hard not to argue we aren't, as a community, in a stronger position for this stringent, demanding process. BIBFRAME needs something similar. Now, I'm not arguing today that we need to constitute a steering committee and a BIBFRAME advisor committee. Those may come in time. But we do want to establish, as a first step, a process for requesting changes and additions to BIBFRAME that brings us closer to the robust process we have in MARC. Some years ago, we established a GitHub repository to help with the management of BIBFRAME change requests. All of the changes from the latest update are represented by GitHub issues, most of which came from members of the wider community. I want to state for absolute clarity that we think the GitHub method worked, and we want to stick with it. But I also want to make it clear that we, and that's a community, need to do it better. Now, better does not necessarily mean Mac level papers, but better does mean we need to take the concepts we have relied on for decades and apply them to the maintenance of BIBFRAME. A good GitHub issue will contain some narrative explanation of the problem and the need to address it with a BIBFRAME ontology change, as well as many of the other ingredients that today go into making a good Mac discussion paper. It should detail what about the current BIBFRAME vocabulary makes something impossible or not right. If new classes and/or properties are proposed, suggested names should be provided along with a label, a definition, and any editorial notes. If a new property is being proposed, include the type of property and any suggested domains and ranges. If it is a class, submit the type of class and whether it is a subclass of another class. There should be examples showing the outcome of the proposed change, if applicable. All of the changes that might be in place should be bundled under a single GitHub issue and discussed as a whole. For example, proposing an inverse to an existing property and asking to remove the domain or range of the existing property should not be treated as discrete requests. Thematically and functionally, they are related. In these early days still with BIBFRAME, when our systems have not calcified and therefore remain flexible, we also want to encourage experimentation before submitting change requests. Theoretical wants and desires are well and good, and there is sometimes a place for them. But one of the tenets we have tried to adhere to ourselves in the Library of Congress is experimenting with something first and then deciding whether the solution worked and is worth keeping. It is assumed, therefore, that any individual and/or organization requesting a change to the ontology be actually working with BIBFRAME data. This is not an unreasonable expectation. At LC, we have used what we call the BFLC namespace for experimentation. It is where we minted, for example, the hub class while we are experimenting with it for more than a year before promoting it to the main ontology, once we knew it was a keeper. It is where we have minted other properties and classes that we are testing, but which we have not yet determined merit elevation. It is where we created properties we feel we need or needed that will never be promoted to the main ontology. BFLC is a test region we encourage others to emulate for themselves. And we're not alone in this either. The National Library of Sweden has done something similar locally. They've imported the BIBFRAME vocabulary into a local namespace where they can augment and experiment with their own classes and properties. An example of which is on your screen, and I'm sure we're all very curious now what libris::maybe does and is. In any event, with real-life testing, I cannot stress enough how much stronger a change request becomes when there is some practical experience behind the proposal. BIBFRAME is about actually encoding information in real life. It is not a conceptual model based on the theory of the idea. BIBFRAME is where the rubber meets the road and must haul all forms of material and cataloging communities along with it. While a number of the specific points I made a moment ago stem from our experience wading through and dealing with the 50 issues we recently closed, I want to acknowledge that we provided no guidelines or expectations to the community. In an effort to remedy this, We have more fully fleshed out the contributing section of the GitHub repository to address this shortcoming. Now, some of what I have discussed and described might strike some as overly formal, as creating more work and overhead for those wishing to request changes in BIBFRAME. To a degree, you are correct. But I would argue more strongly that the upfront effort will save the time and energy of everyone who will review changes and participate in the discussion. And I'm thinking of the broader community, not just us at LC. Community participants will also benefit from being able to review the request in a comprehensive manner. A holistic presentation will also provide the necessary documentation so that the BIBFRAME community, like the MARC, can go back and review a quarter century of changes and have those changes be as clear and understandable today as they were 25 years ago. We also expect such an approach to facilitate more responsive feedback from everyone involved and result in quicker action. On that last point, I can make no absolute promises about timing, but I can say that we would like to have changes to BIBFRAME be on a 6-month cycle, just like MARC. But the reality might mean changes happen in 5 months or 8 months as time permits. We will, however, endeavor to be better at making the time. BIBFRAME is very much a new format still, one that will likely experience more changes in a shorter time when compared to MARC, which has decades of stability and history behind it. To date, we have an extraordinarily substantial basis in the current ontology and vocabulary. It has most of the ingredients that we need and want, but we also know it will change. And we aspire to have a format that is in every way as responsive and as strong as MARC. Beginning the formalization of the change process will move us in that direction. Thank you. I don't know, whether we take questions now or hold them for later.
Thank you. And thank you, Kevin. And the first question is from Osma Suminen from National Library of Finland. And Osma, you can take it yourself. Are you on the screen, Yes.
Oh, hello. Yes. Yeah, it was just a comment, not really a question, but I just wanted to point out that this change from mandated formal domains and ranges to suggested usage was a similar change was made very recently in the Dublin core schema, metadata schema, where similarly these formal ranges were dropped in favor of suggested domain includes and range includes statements, and which again is basically what the idea was taken from the schema.org vocabulary, which does the same thing. So it doesn't have formal ranges, but just suggests the expected ranges, but it's not mandatory. Thanks.
Yeah, we've noted, if we've learned anything in the last several years, it's that trying to be overly restrictive or formal at the ontological level is causing more problems than they're solving in many cases. So we need to relax it a little bit. It's not surprising that it's happening elsewhere too.
Thank you. I can see there's a question on way from Friedrich Klingwall. And it writes that we have used the SDO versions of these to introduce flexibility in our KBV vocabulary of Library of Sweden. It's also a comment. There's more comments or questions to Kevin? Nobody's typing. And no one here. One. there is Laura Ackerman is typing, so we take, what is the review process for the GitHub issues? Kevin?
What is the regular process?
The review process.
Oh, the review process.
Yes.
Well, the issue is publicly posted, and of course, anybody, and we encourage feedback from the community, should weigh in one way or the other about any proposal that is made. We typically discuss them internally or just ourselves. It's easier to do that synchronously, but we then try to take whatever outcome from our internal discussion is, and try to put it up on GitHub, so that there's some record of that. We did for this release, and we will continue to do this in the future. We did compile all the changes that we have proposed making, and we sent them to a few targeted representatives of large implementations, Share VDE, LD4P, for example, such as the National Library of Sweden too, just to give them a special opportunity to make any comment before we push the 2.1 update. So that was what we did for this one. How that will change, will that change in the future one, I'm not entirely sure, but the review process, in short, it's all in GitHub. It's public. We want it to be an open and transparent thing where we can.
Laura additionally asked how it is decided what to change, the formal decision process. You described the formal process for MARC, but what is how do you conclude about changes in BIBFRAME?
Oh, well, I think we're moving in that direction. I think we're beginning that formalization process right now. I think that is exactly what I was talking about. It's that, it's a little open-ended right now, and that's by design, so that we can see if we can get to if we can organically develop a good formalization process for review. But as of right now, the process is the GitHub issues with hopefully participation and debate there, to see if we can see if consensus can be developed.
Okay, thank you. I can say to everybody that there's been a question about GitHub link, and this question, what is the GitHub link? I'm sure it's on the presentation, but it also now answered by Matt Miller from Library of Congress in Slack. So you can go directly now and try it.
I have
a break. Okay. And there's also Osma has been so kind to distribute the link exact with instruction for contribution. So information on Slack. Okay. Thank you, Kevin.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
And then we will. We will go on to the next part of next session, and it is what role can RDA, RDF play in the transition to linked data, to linked library data. And we have two moderators, Crystal Clemens and Theo Gerontakis, both from University of Washington. And the panelist is Karen Coyle, Gordon Dunche, Diane Hillman, Demain Isminger, or Sofia Sapundi. So I give over the screen to the moderators.
Okay, I'll briefly share my screen. You should be seeing a slide now. What role can RDA play?
It works.
Okay, great. Well, this is the panel discussion entitled "What Role Can RDA/RDF Play in the Transition to Linked Library Data?" Crystal Clements and I, Theo Gerontagos, will be moderators. We're both from the University of Washington Libraries. And we're joined by the 5 well-known panelists that were just introduced, but we won't introduce them any further to save time. However, there is a link that you'll find in the Day 3 Data Exchange Slack channel. And we've also have it on every slide that we provide here at the bottom right of the slide. And that link leads to these slides, the discussion questions and the panelist biographies. The questions, that we have one directed at each panelist, were presented to the panelists before today's event. And as a result, their remarks may be prepared remarks. We've asked the panelists to provide remarks on the question or question area that require no more than 4 minutes. And if a panelist remarks last 4 minutes, the moderators will interrupt them to let them know that time has expired. So I'll go to the first question, which is for Sofia Zapunido. And it is, RDA has been painstakingly aligned with the library reference model, the LRM, and BIBFRAME has not. One of the most talked about areas of concern is the absence of an expression entity in BIBFRAME. Well, could this or any other incompatibilities between RDA and BIBFRAME have significant impacts? And I'll stop sharing my screen. Oops, way over here. And I'll give it over to Sophia.
Okay, so I will share my screen. Thank you for the question, Theo, and for the invitation to this panel. Before answering your question, I will make a question. Why do we want to use linked data? And there are many answers to this question. And one of them is that we hope that with linked data technologies, we can better support the explore user task. So we can help our users to navigate through the bibliographic universe. And the key mechanisms in our data to do that is and of bibliographic. So the absence of an entity.
Sophia, you're breaking up. Your audio is breaking up very badly. Is everybody else experiencing that?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, can you hear me now?
It's still broken.
I'm
sorry.
Can you hear me now?
No, it's not coming through.
Okay.
Sometimes it helps to turn off video.
It's not coming through at all.
Sophia, maybe you could try turning off your video and just sharing your screen.
No. Well, you want to come back to Sophia, maybe? Oh, still not coming through.
Yeah, let's maybe move on to the next question and then we can go back to Sophia.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
This question is for Damien Eismaner. The RDA toolkit can be used by libraries to produce data for different implementation scenarios: flat files, bibliographic and authority records, relational or object-oriented databases, and linked open data. For the final scenario, linked open data, RDA data can be created using the RDA element sets expressed in RDF. However, several libraries use the BIBFRAME linked data model for creating data based on the RDA standard. Should they be using RDA/RDF?
Thank you for the question. So to quote from an announcement from the Committee of Principals for RDA, which is now the RDA board, from 29 May 2015, quote, RDA is a package of data elements, guidelines, and instructions for creating library and cultural heritage resource metadata that are well-formed according to international models for user-focused linked data applications, unquote. The current international model for bibliographic information is the IFLO Library Reference Model, or LRM, a consolidation of the previous FR models, FRBR, FRAD, and FRSAD. RDA is a practical implementation of LRM, and in conformance with the Committee of Principles statement concerning linked data applications, the principles and practices relevant to the linked data community underlie the entities, elements, and vocabulary encoding schemes of RDA. These are all represented in RDF, and they are freely available to download from the RDA registry in several serializations. The developers of the RDF representations of the RDA vocabularies, several of whom are on this panel today, recognized that there will be many semantic web applications that may not wish to use the RDA element sets or that do not require the LRM semantics, but that would like to make use of data produced using RDA in their applications. To that end, the RDA registry contains alignments and mappings from RDA to other vocabularies, such as Dublin Core and MARC 21. The registry also contains an alignment and mapping to an unconstrained element set that have no domain or range and therefore can be used in non-LRM applications. The unconstrained set could also be used as the basis for transformations of the unconstrained properties into properties from other vocabularies. All of this is to say that while the full RDA semantics are available in RDF and can certainly be used by anyone, the RSC also recognizes that others will wish to use RDA data in non-RDA applications. So the question posed, should they be using RDA RDF, is maybe not the question to be asking. Perhaps the question should be, how can RDA and RDF be used in cataloging workflows for metadata production and distribution? For example, at the metadata creation process, a cataloger could describe a resource using a subset of the RDA vocabularies defined via an application profile using the RDA RDF representations. That metadata description set can then be the basis from which other metadata description sets are automatically derived based on application needs. So, is your application a traditional ILS using data derived from MARC 21 records? The RDA registry provides a map to transform native RDA to MARC 21, and that map could be used to do this. Similarly, native RDA could be transformed into BIBFRAME for those wishing to use a BIBFRAME application. The same goes for Dublin Core and other vocabularies. To sum up, the RDF representations of the RDA vocabularies can be used in a myriad of different ways, either for use in applications that want to make use of the full semantic richness of RDA and LRM, or as a possible starting point for transforming RDA data to be used in a non-RDA application. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. I'll share my screen briefly and ask the next question. The next question is for Gordon Dunsire, and it is RDA LRM expressed as RDF contains elements that are essentially reified property chains known as shortcuts, while BibFrame features many property chains that are not reified as specific elements, what many people call nested data. What are the pros and cons of property chains and reification, and do they cause interoperability problems? And I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you, Theo, for the question, and hi, everybody. You're going to get a prepared response from me, and there won't be any visuals, so you'll have to put up with my voice. The shortcut elements in RDA are essentially pre-LRM elements that map to a chain of 2 or more post-LRM elements. This shortcut mechanism is a feature of the LRM and the associated SciDoc conceptual reference model. The shortcut elements are retained in RDA to further a goal of the 3R project to support continuity and minimize disruption for RDA communities. In future, new shortcut elements are likely to be useful for local extensions and applications. A shortcut element is a simplified view of a path through a complex structure. It's a path through a complex graph. Only the start and end of the path are identified. A classic example is the work manifested element that ignores the intermediary expression entity. It connects the work directly with a manifestation. Such simplification benefits the local application by cloaking unnecessary complexity and reducing the burden of identity management. But this is at the expense of external applications that wish to reuse the metadata. A service that focuses on expressions, such as translations, will not find work manifested statements very useful at all, since they don't mention expressions. RDA Toolkit therefore displays a standard note for each shortcut element to warn that the instances of intermediary entities are not identified when the element is used. A typical warning is the element does not identify any expression that realizes the work. This exposes the trade-off when using a shortcut. It's convenient for local use, but less of a contribution to the wider community. Shortcuts are also useful for mappings between ontologies. For example, the map between RDA and LRM elements includes many mappings between a fine-grained RDA relationship element and the broadest possible LRM element, thing is associated with thing, I paraphrase. The precision of the mapping can be increased by substituting an implicit LRM shortcut as the target. But such a shortcut is not reified in the LRM itself. So simple RDFS mapping properties, such as subproperty of, cannot be used in a map between RDA and LRM that uses shortcuts. A more complex property instead, such as OWL property chain axiom, is required, but this results in increased overheads in using the map for the interoperability of instance data. This also has a negative impact on reuse of data by applications that do not use web ontology language properties. Many applications prefer to remain within RDF syntax, for example. There are policy and management issues associated with property chains that are not reified. If RDA uses a property chain in a map to another ontology, it is effectively reifying the chain in place of the reification that has not already been made by the maintainer of the target ontology. This is a question of authority and branding. Is the reification part of RDA or part of the other ontology? It will certainly use an RDA namespace, for example, and be branded as such. What happens if the other ontology changes the component properties of the chain? The RDA steering committee has established communication protocols with the maintainers of other relevant ontologies to alleviate the problems that can arise, not just with shortcuts, of course. Such protocols can also inform the development of the target ontology itself. An externally reified shortcut that is heavily used is an indicator of a candidate for internal reification. For example, a local RDA community may identify a useful RDA property chain, reify it as a community resource element, and then propose it as a new RDA shortcut element with appropriate evidence of its general utility.
We've reached the 4-minute mark.
Our final paragraph, more generally, these are issues of identity, authority, and transparency. A community can reduce its own costs by not identifying everything in its own linked data but that increases the cost for other communities who wish to reuse that data. Local identification is often regarded as an authoritative identification, so a lack of verification may be interpreted as a quality and trust issue. Finally, that which is not identified is invisible in the semantic web, a form of dark linked data. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. I think Sophia Zapanido is ready again, and we can go back to question one. I can repose the question.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now better. Okay. Okay. Sorry for the inconvenience. Would you like to make the question again, or shall I start, Theo?
Go ahead and start. I think we all know the question.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so before answering the question about the incompatibilities, I want to make a question: why do we want to use linked data? And there are many answers to this question, and one of them is that we want to enable the explore your user task. We want to support this user task, and the key mechanisms for that are the representations of bibliographic families and bibliographic relationships. And the absence of an entity, of an expression entity in BIBFRAME has a negative impact on the representation of these two mechanisms. But let me have an example. Here we have a work with 3 expressions. They're not linked to one another, and they are implicitly linked by being the realizations of the same progenitor work. So here the progenitor work works as a very good collocation mechanism. And due to the semantics of the BIBFRAME work class that includes ideas and signs, when we have this representation in BIBFRAME, we have 3 works that are not linked to one another. So the family is lost. Of course, if we have information that a specific set of signs is related to another specific set of signs, we can have a relationship, we can represent that. And of course, we can also represent this relationship in BIBFRAME. But sometimes, just to be sure to have this information that a specific expression is related to another one is a research issue of its own, and we need experts about that. And we don't always have access to those experts. So what do we do as catalogers? We often represent this relationship at the upper level, at the more generic level, at the work level. And this relationship cannot be represented in BIBFRAME. So we lose something here. And of course, I'm not the very first one that has identified this issue. And this is why in BIBFRAME and in SRFDE, they have introduced new classes. And when somebody sees this beautiful slide, we'll suppose that these 4 levels are equivalent to one another. And this is not the case, because in LRM and RDA, we've got ideas at the work level, signs at the expression level, format, and exemplars. But in BIBFRAME, the hub class is a class to aggregate things that share characteristics. For example, all Spanish translations of Tom Sawyer. But this is not. This cannot be perceived as an equivalent class to work. And of course, the BIBFRAME work class includes both ideas and signs, so it cannot be considered as equivalent to the expression entity, and the same happens in the SRFDE ontology. Another incompatibility is that BIBFRAME has a small number of properties for the representation of the derivative relationship. So if we have this relationship in BIBFRAME, we don't know exactly if in RDA it can be mapped to a revision or to an adaptation, so expression of 2 different works. There are other incompatibilities, and one of the conclusions in my thesis has been that we can overcome this if we adopt common cataloging practices. But since the clock is ticking, I will just say thank you, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Okay, I will stop sharing now.
Thank you. This question is for Diane Hillman. Is the RDA registry conceived as a standalone resource for creating linked library data? Why does the RDA registry continue to be developed while many influential libraries are adopting BIBFRAME?
Well, thank you, and so pleased to be among the exceptional company. Like Gordon, I'm going to do a somewhat prepared statement, basically addressing those questions without any slides. So the question asks, what is the RDA registry? Is it a standalone resource or what is it? My business partner, John Phipps, who has worked with me on the registry for almost 20 years now, really calls it the plumbing. And I think that expresses a good bit of what its role is. The registry, the RDA registry and resources like it are intended to serve as a basis for the services that support the building of data on behalf of libraries and other users. In the current data environment, we no longer expect all libraries to use one data standard, such as we had done with MARC, and thus the creators of those data standards are expected to support usage by providing descriptive vocabularies and URIs for both properties, classes / elements, and values. Registries like RDAs are optimized to support frequent changes, downloads to a variety of users, as well as translations and maps between standards. This creates a basis for other data standards to coexist and ease the building and reuse of tools that can support the creators of data wherever they are and whatever standards they prefer. Our long experience with MARC drove the expectation that libraries would always prefer one and only one standard. But even before the advent of Dublin Core in the 90s, a sort of a disruption event, other library specialties were developing bespoke data standards. DAX for archives, Museum DAT, VRA Core for artworks. One size never fit all. And we should stop expecting that to happen. So to the ever repeated question, what should we use? The only relevant answer is that depends. The usual recommendation I added to that is to choose as a basis for your data description the richest one you can afford and support. You can always dumb down, but rarely smarten up. So the second part of the question about why does the RDA registry continue to be developed while many influential libraries are adopting BIBFRAME? And my point is, if one size will never fit all, why should the development of the RDA registry languish? Because influential libraries, in scary quotes, for whatever reasons, are adopting BIBFRAME. The BIBFRAME effort doesn't seem to have built a corresponding service to the RDA registry, but perhaps it could be encouraged to do so. IFLA, the source of the vocabulary such as ISBD, LRM, Ferber, Unimark, is building a registry for their standards using the same registry platform and to provide easier access, better maintenance capabilities, and improved tool development for the community. So you can find that at iflastandards.info if you want to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane Hillman. We're going to move on. We're running a little over, but we're going to move on to question 5 for Karen Coyle, all the same. So I will quickly share the question, which is, how can libraries best manage all the data models available for library linked data? Are there more sustainable models than BIBFRAME and RDA? I'll turn it over to Karen.
I'll try to go as quickly as I can. One of the first things I want to say is that the idea of linked data is that you can link to other people's data, not just your own. And we tend to be very much in a little library box. Both RDA, RDF, and BibFrame are very complex ontologies. They serve specific library applications, and they both have a lot of library baggage, which is, you know, the cataloging rules, the RDA toolkit, and MARC. So the best data model for us would be one that is flexible, generalizable, and one that would make sense to people beyond libraries. So although Ferber and LRM have provided some rethinking of library data, they're still both very much tied to the past. And what we really lack is what the F in Ferber was supposed to be, which is a functional analysis of our data. We are very good at saying what to do, and rarely do any of our standards say why. And we really need that why. So our today's catalogs, today's library data really still is caught in the 1875 Charles M. E. Cutter statement of, you know, people need to be able to come to a library and find what they're looking for by author, by title, by subject, and by genre. And we haven't gone beyond that. And we really need to think about how today our libraries and our users are very different to the libraries and users of 1875. So I think that we need to understand more why we're doing what we're doing and what we would like to do in the future, so that we can leave the past somewhat behind and not let libraries and their data become an anachronism, but have them to be part of the general linked data world. And I'll stop there.
Yes, and thank you to the panel. And we have some minutes over, so we go directly to the break. And I think we can make it a little bit shorter than the 10 minutes we have in the agenda. Okay, can you make that, Anna or Antonio?
Yes.
Okay.
How long shall we?
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Okay.
Okay, we see you in 6 minutes.
See you later.
Yeah, hello again, and we are ready to start, and I will give over the screen to, I will give over the screen to Philip Scheuer from Stanford University, who will moderate the session about BIBFRAME data exchange. Philip, go on.
Great. Great, thank you very much, Live. So welcome everyone to this final session of the BIBFRAME Workshop in Europe's 2021 meeting. The inspiration for this meeting has two roots. The first is in the Mellon-funded grant I'm deeply involved in called Linked Data for Production. Back when this series of grants began in 2015, we identified key areas for development. First, the cloud space we work in as a community will be at the heart of what we do. To get it straight from the beginning will be essential, because as the effort expands to all libraries, this space will need to expand to accommodate them. It will also define how we work together as a community in a new linked open data environment. The second, again, focused on the cloud space and identifying that cloud space as the data warehouse for what we create. And last, we identified the need for the development of a communication infrastructure to connect this cloud environment to our local environments. This issue of the community coming together to work in common environments and to share the data they create was identified as the most difficult issue to overcome. And I think it's clear that it still is. The second inspiration for this panel was an offhand comment made by a member of the Swedish National Library, I believe, at last year's conference. And that was, it would indeed be ironic if we all needed to convert our BIBFRAME data to MARC in order to exchange it. The session today is broken into two parts. The first will be a report on a meeting held by the Program for Cooperative Cataloging on BIBFRAME data exchange. Our reporters will be Reinhold Heuvelmann and Frederick Klingwall. The next part of the meeting will be a panel discussion of the three questions you can see printed in our agenda. The members of the panel are Frederick Klingwall from the Kungliga Biblioteket, Alan Danskin from the British Library, Sally McCallum from the Library of Congress, and Chiara Storti from the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale Firenze. I will pose the questions one by one to each of the panelists for their responses. And if we have time at the end, we can open it up to the attendees for questions as well. So first, let's turn it over to Frederick and Reinhold for their report on the PCC meeting.
Thank you, Philip. Let's see here, I will share the screen. There we go. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, my name is Frederick. As Philip said, I am from the National Library of Sweden, which is Kungliga Biblioteket in Swedish. And Reinhold, you can start the presentation. I will try to keep up with the slides for this presentation.
Yes, I'm Reinhold Heuvelmann from the German National Library, library standard specialist here. And in this case, mostly an observer and a messenger here, because the meeting, the report that we are giving on the PCC meeting on BIBFRAME data exchange, I was there as an observer as well. Next slide, please. So this meeting took part September. It was online. It was on BIBFRAME data exchange, chaired by Melanie Wacker from Columbia University. The program for PCC, the program for cooperative cataloging, called a two-day meeting to discuss exchange of BIBFRAME data between systems and implementations. There are a number of different projects experimenting or implementing BIBFRAME and linked data. An essential question now is to ensure that we can all talk to each other in the end. That was the outline of the meeting. The goals and expected outcomes was a better understanding of who is committed to which types of services, tooling, to identify what exchanges are desired between rich systems, to identify challenges and showstoppers and steps to address them, and shared ownership of challenges and support for BIBFRAME implementation. And lastly, determine next steps to keep the conversation going. Next slide, please. I've put together on this slide a large variety of everyone who was represented during this meeting. So it shows the diversity of who was involved and who is interested, and at least in the BIBFRAME. I won't read them out loud. Next slide, please. Zooming out a little bit, maybe as a map or a broader picture, we've stolen this from a presentation 2 years ago from Abigail Sparling and Ian Bigelow. It always helps me to get a picture of the BIBFRAME initiative and the BIBFRAME community as a whole. And here you can see overlapping circles. And the program for cooperative cataloging plays a significant role in this whole circle. So it seems to be clear that cooperation and communication is very important in this phase of the whole process. Yeah, next slide, please. The meeting started with a report by Beecher Wiggins from the Library of Congress about a meeting in itself in August. Participants were Library of Congress and Stanford and Share VDE and OCLC with their specific questions and agendas. And they came to conclusions and to the results that it does make a lot of sense to create working groups, and that is the down left corner. One use case working group and one data exchange working group to drive the development further. And there may be more of working groups. And as well, they agreed that future summits will be invoked and organized to continue the conversation as well. It is a little bit weird to report in this meeting about a meeting 2 weeks ago and in response about a meeting in August, but for me it still shows this ongoing communication in between meetings and in meetings as well. Yeah, next slide, please. And
yes.
I hand it over to Fredrik.
One of the first sections where we actually talk about the data exchange and what it means in a BIBFRAME environment was introduced by Philip and moderated with some original questions that was raised, and how we as a community have a common interpretation of what data exchange means, because this might not be evident. We know exactly how we are doing data exchange and what means we have now with the MARC ecosystem, but what are the new kind of practicalities that we have to start thinking about, and how do we make data accessible, which is maybe the first and foremost important question, but also how do we practically handle change in form of updates, whether these take place, in what kind of system and network spaces, and what is actually triggering these updates. So that one is one of the big questions to actually, I don't think we have arrived at any answer to this, but this is one of the main tenets of the panel later on, I would assume. Also, how do we avoid creating silos going forward? And how do we facilitate use of different linked data services like ID Lockov? Because this is not only about the bibliographic data. There are lots of sources for other things in our linked data. And also, how do we map these together if we have different data sources? For example, like ID Lockov and RD registry, for example. And how do we come to agreements and data usage? This was a little bit PCC centric, which is not really my forte here, but I think the main agreement that we have here is that we want to make the data as usable as possible, and not only in the PCC sense, but with the whole community, and that means the European work groups as well. And this also became more evident when we come to the agreement on core needs for BIBFRAME interchange, which was a topic introduced by Jeremy Nelson at the Stanford University and Sally McCallum from the Library of Congress. There were some particular questions that we need to address going forward. Should it be one standardized serialization, and if so, who maintains it? Is there a need for an agreed upon minimum BIBFRAME description? How to model shape BIBFRAME elements, developments of tools, including validation techniques, implementations for discovery layer and user experience. And this kind of also brought up the questions regarding conversions to MARC and how we deal with the two different ecosystems going forward. And to you, Reinhold?
Yes. One very interesting analysis provided by Jeremy Nelson, the interchange challenges. As far as understood, he took data created in Share VDE and by Library of Congress and in Sinopia and compared them to each other, and pointed out the differences and the implications about these. So this is the bottom-up approach of what is really there as data, and that was very interesting and raised very interesting questions as well. Next slide, please. And Sally McCallum noted a core need for BIBFRAME interchange. We do need a simplified and coordinated MARC to BIBFRAME conversion and a simplified and coordinated BIBFRAME to MARC conversion. That was my understanding. And she gave some reasons for that. So this would be a key need in moving forward. The conversion back and forth has to be simplified and coordinated. Yeah. Over to you. Yes.
So day two focused more on workflows and tooling. And the first section, which brought up the use cases and best practices, for a question of when and why to link and when to copy and create data caches locally. This is a question we will probably return to in the panel as well. But here we had the opportunity to hear from some of the vendors and how their perspective is on when they are using BIBFRAME in either roadmaps or in the current state, as part of LD as an ecosystem or environment, and how interoperability can be achieved in this sense. And also, I think it was Jane Burke who brought up some of the challenges, which I noted particularly, which is the diversity in point of view and dealing with multiple sources, deduplicating and combining data, and what is actually the packet of data that we are constituting the distribution part of data when it's split on several entities. And then we had a section where Christy Thomas shared some experiences from the University of Chicago as a soon-to-be Folio implementer, and Michelle Casalini told us about an integration workflow between OCLC and Share VDE. And just to have some practical reports on what's going on there. And that was more or less the content of the workshop. There was a lot of talk in how and what to do in the next steps. And there will actually be a comprehensive summary of this published soon. It's under production, so I hope we will be able to provide a link for that pretty soon. But as the questions were in the beginning, I think some of them we are actually just starting to scratch on the surface. They are certainly important, but they are not solvable in a 2-day conference. But I think what brought to me kind of sense of urgency and momentum is we have a shared ownership of the challenges, and I think it's very important that we bring together efforts so we do not do as much duplication of work, but also we need to get, I think, to these focus groups that we talked about so that we can have the right people working with the right questions. As I understand, the PCC Policy Committee will discuss this at our November meeting, how they can develop a framework for cooperation, but also furthering these conversations, like in this workshop, for example, is a great opportunity to determine what the next steps are for this and keep the momentum going around these questions. And we have some links here for you. I think if you download this presentation later, you can read more about what the PCC are. There are probably also some people here who attended the workshop that can answer further in the Slack channel. And with that, we thank you from us. And this is the report of the PCC workshop on BIBFRAME.
Great. Thank you very much, Reinhold and Frederick. So I know there's some questions. I'm anxious to move on to the panel. I will just briefly answer a couple. We'll see if there's time at the end for more discussion. Jim just points out the importance of being able to do crosswalks between various forms, and I totally agree that's important. And Crystal, it's very interesting about the sort of brief MARC record. So it's one of the things Stanford is very interested in. We call it an operational record, and for us, it's just meant to it needs to be able to supply some functions in the ILS. So things like circulation. So we don't mean it to fulfill all the functions that a full record would be in our traditional ILS. But I think that's going to depend on institution to institution what they consider that sort of brief MARC record should contain. I'd like to move on to the panel now. And again, the questions really are focused on data interchange, and they were meant to be very broad so that the panelists could take it whatever direction they want. And the panelists did see the questions ahead of time, so they've had a bit of chance to think about it. So the first question that we had for the panelists was, from your perspective, should there be a standard form for communication between nodes of bibliographic data in RDF? What are the advantages and disadvantages? I think we've noted that the web is an open place with many different standards. So let's start out with that question. And why don't I turn to Sally first for her thoughts before going on to the others.
Sally, you're muted.
Sally, you're muted.
Okay, now after talking a little bit, repeat what I just said. You come at this from several different angles, and for instance, the use of the same ontology or even specific elements from ontologies, you can mandate those kinds of things. This is what we're used to in MARC. It's not clear that's what we need. It's not clear whether we do or don't need it. One can look at the shape of the RDF differently. Blank nodes, direct resource links, all sorts of flexibility that you have in RDF, and decide whether in fact you need to have sort of practices with respect to those. And then there's the amount of data to include. Labels, URIs and labels. If you include labels, you enable instant display, but you also increase the need for blank nodes probably. If you exchange URIs without labels, they have to do a lookup and but when they do a lookup, theoretically, more information is available at the lookup, more links and more richness to the data. So that's a positive, or both of them. And then there's the different serializations. So in conclusion, I think that agreements on aspects of form will result in efficiencies and easier understanding of the data, but we don't know what the parameters are yet. And that's exactly what the kind of thing that the PCC, I think, is going to be grappling with and will provide a guidance to the community.
Great, thanks much, Sally. So why don't I next ask Chiara to see what your thoughts might be on the same issue of this communication.
Yes. I will begin by apologizing to all of you, since I feel I'm probably not the right person to be speaking at a panel like this. To be honest, the debate on BIBFRAME and on the sharing of bibliographic data on the web doesn't seem to be a priority for our Italian libraries. I still hope that my reflection can make a contribution to today's discussion. Libraries in the past 50 years have faced two main challenges in cataloging: how to share bibliographic data between libraries, and then how to share library data on the web. Italy's National Library Service, SBN, has a 30-year-long tradition of sharing bibliographic data among libraries to economize and speed up cataloging activities. However, I think this long tradition has reached its limit. I think we are trying to move from a MARC to a BIBFRAME standard without changing our view. In Italy, the few attempts to convert MARC data into BIBFRAME have resulted in bringing more data from the web to library catalogs, for example, from VIA for Wikidata and so on, or in exchanging data between GLAM institutions, but not in bringing data from library catalogs to the web. Even nowadays, if a user searches for library data on the web from a search engine, they cannot find them. From this point of view, we should also invest a little more in friendly data query interfaces, not just SparkWell, for example, as we invested in OPAC 30 years ago. It's true, in 2021, users are the machines, but traditional users continue to exist too. So in my view, the Linked Data for Production project has the right approach to the problem: to use BIBFRAME ontologies in a real and accessible environment of data sharing and discovery, and in collaboration with Wikidata, that has a consolidated working well model to structure and to discover data in a friendly way. That's all.
Great, thank you very much. So next, why don't I go to Alan? And again, thank you very much. I know that Angie was not able to make this meeting, and you are replacing him in this panel, and I am very grateful. So what are your thoughts on this idea about the communication aspect?
Yeah, I think we haven't really engaged with the BIBFRAME very much so far. We're certainly involved with Share VDE, and from our perspective, or at least from a MARC user perspective at the moment, I think our concern is that we are still able to get data going forward over time, so that there's going to be a long tail of MARC users, regardless of libraries sharing RDF and linked data, and so I think transformations between the different structures in which data is communicated is going to be essential for the whole community. transformations that go both ways if we're to continue to share data effectively.
Great, thank you very much. And then Frederick.
Thank you. I think if we look beyond RDF and the techniques that is actually in there, that technique stack, one of the most important question is, what is the unit of descriptions we are actually looking at here? Since we have gone from records describing bib, auth, and holds, we have now more distinct entities, which we can, in some way could perhaps call top entities, but a subject and an agent has very different shapes than just a auth record as we see them today. And also, if we look at what mechanisms we might need, internally at the Library of Sweden, we have a mechanism where we embellish our data for the indexes, which means that we're actually just storing the URIs in our database, but we have ways to describe which details we find interesting about each entity. And when we pick that up, for example, a label or a description or a link to something else as well. So that is something that I think maybe the community could look at, but we really need to apply your question. So what is the data exchange and we're talking about, and break down our needs, and what is the involved actors actually need and want, because this is not a easy question to answer in that way. And whether we need something that locks down serializations of RDF in some ways for certain applications, I think we should wait and see what our actual needs are and what the ecosystem might be too soon to say, because there are linked data notification standards, web substandard. Do we need these in some way to have feeds on when data is updated, or how should we communicate between the data nodes? I think that is something that we practically has to experiment a little bit to going forward with the answers we need for that.
Great, thank you very much. I think it is a great point. I remember the original discussions about BIBFRAME as a method of communication, but I think what is truly coming to fore now is, what is it that we want to communicate? And then also, not only what do we want to communicate, but what do others want to receive? So it is a more complicated question. I'd like to shift now to the second question, and it was focused on MARC. So the world of data in libraries will be split between MARC and linked data for many years to come. Should these two worlds be kept in sync with each other? So before I ask the question of the panel, I have to admit, I was had an earlier conversation this week about MARC. And I think one of the issues I try to remind myself of is that in many ways, there is sort of this comparison between MARC and BIBFRAME going on now, but BIBFRAME is at the earliest part of its life, and MARC has been going on for a while. So I know there are some people probably here as well that I don't remember the beginning of MARC, but I remember what we had to go through at Stanford as we transitioned to MARC. And there were many, many long years of projects of converting cards to MARC, the inability to work with MARC in its fullness the way we do now when we first started out with MARC. So it can be a bit of a false comparison between the two just because of the different stages of their life cycle. But first, let's get back to the question about MARC and BIBFRAME, and clearly acknowledge the fact that some libraries will want to use MARC for many years to come. Others are shifting to BIBFRAME, but then there is the data itself. And I know there was a comment from Karen Coyle earlier on saying, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to think about round tripping, or we could move to BIBFRAME without needing to convert back to MARC and then go back to BIBFRAME. So although I'm not exactly talking about round tripping, we're just talking about maintenance of the data in MARC and BIBFRAME. But should we think about maintaining this sort of compatibility or exactness between the data that's captured in MARC and BIBFRAME? So let me start again with the panel, and this time Well, I know I started with Sally last time, but I know the Library of Congress has been thinking about it a lot because you will be conversion to MARC and exposure of that data as MARC for libraries that need it is very important. So why don't I start with you again for this question?
Okay. This time I'm not mute too. Okay, I would say your question really, you said, should these two worlds be kept in sync with each other? And in general, I would say no. It's because I think it's impossible to actually keep those two worlds in general in sync. But let's discuss the word split, because you said that the world is split between MARC and linked data. And I think that it has a little bit of a negative sound to it. I think that the environment will instead be mixed, and which does not sound as negative. As I mentioned on Tuesday, we need to have a goal of making the conversions between MARC and BibFrame as easy and as fluid as possible, so that that doesn't become an issue on doing the things we have been doing and want to do. I was very interested in what you said about the transition from cards to MARC, because that was such an upheaval, since it was from something printed to the machine. Now we're going from a machine that looks like this to a machine that looks like that. And I'm hoping that transition, the two can mix together and the transition won't be as difficult. But that said, I think that there are no two repositories today, MARC repositories, that are in sync. Adding BibFrame is not going to change that. The fact that that we don't keep our data sets in sync. But of course, there's always still a place for interchange of updates, changes to data descriptions, depending on the application. And so applications will essentially guide what we do and how far we go with respect to being in sync. That's my opinion.
Great, thanks very much, Sally. So why don't I go to Alan next? I know that you are relatively new to Share VDE, and the thought of moving your data towards BibFrame and MARC is very important to you. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective in the British Library, what your thoughts are about this issue of trying to understand that connection between the BibFrame and MARC data and sort of the need to keep them in sync, whatever that means in a broad sense.
Yeah, I don't think that we can expect to keep linked data and MARC in sync. And I think it would be unfair or unreasonable to expect that those who are able to use linked data should be held back by the need to stay in sync with MARC. So I also think that, if the benefits of using linked data are not fully exploited, then the justification to invest in it becomes much more difficult. And so the incentive to actually move away from MARC will be weakened. So I don't think that we need to keep MARC and BibFrame, for example, exactly in sync. And I do think that the development for BibFrame could proceed with as the primary development rather than MARC being sort of seen as a primary now. But as we mentioned previously, we still require interoperability at some level, but we have to recognize that MARC can't necessarily do all of the things that linked data would enable us to do, and that's why we want to move to linked data. And how much investment is it worth making in enabling MARC to do more when we know that it's at end of life, or at least we hope it's at end of life.
Great, thank you very much. And I realized as you were speaking, and Sally was speaking as well, that perhaps it was a poorly worded question. So now that I think about it, it really assumes sort of a record model and wanting to keep records in sync. And if we think about it more in terms, again, it's sort of like communication, what are we communicating? So certainly entities can be kept in sync, because it's in that sense as a controlled heading, and not be so fixated on the sort of the descriptive part of the data. But anyway, let me go to Frederick and see what you think as well.
Yes, having spent a lot of time entrenched in MARC round-trip conversions, I would also say with a resounding no, let's not keep them in sync. I know this is an open-ended question, as you say, but as Alan said, the time and energy to develop a complex way to keep them in sync, it's really taken from the time we would need to develop BIBFRAME or linked data efforts. And that is generally because the MARC format has completely different, it's supposed to be a presentational format, which is not really compatible in the ground with this data model. And I would say, and a lot of people think that perhaps we should, well, let's just scrap the least few fields, but there are more idiosyncrasies in MARC format which make this very, very hard, especially the interpunction, which you have to, if you see it as a person, you can understand it, but with a machine that has to go through millions of records, a little mistake in each interpunction can make something be interpreted as something that it isn't. And there's a lot of repetitions and rules which makes it very hard to go back and forth, which is and especially indicators which can swap the whole meaning of a field. So I mean, the sooner we can leave MARC as the master data in our production, I think the better. But I think, of course, there will be needs for MARC in systems. So I rather see it as an end product, because I don't want to see pipelines going from MARC to BIBFRAME to MARC and then back to BIBFRAME. But once we have converted MARC to BIBFRAME in our production systems that supply data to other systems, I think MARC will still be living on, but not in sync.
Great, thank you. And now, Chiara, what are your thoughts?
I think the answer can only be yes. MARC and BIBFRAME records can be in sync because there are still millions of bibliographic records that exist only in MARC form. And the risk is that not only are they not considered and valued, but they are increasingly hidden by the large amount of data produced on the web. We should build environments where we can continue to manage and share MARC records, and at the same time where we can improve BIBFRAME records. A few years ago, Giovanni Bergamin, maybe you know, former chief of ICT department of the National Central Library of Florence, and Christian Bacchi started a prototype that exports the existing MARC records in a local Wikibase in a very simple way. Wikibase is a multi-ontologies born environment, so it can host at the same time legacy data in MARC before converting or not converting to BIBFRAME, and new bibliographic record in BIBFRAME, making them available simultaneously on the web as linked data. And in 2019, the BNF, National Library of France, has officially embraced this approach for its authority files. And I think this is the most rational way of doing things for the next few years.
Great, thank you very much. And so before we leave the question of MARC for the final question, let me ask one perhaps more painful MARC question. So I think as we were thinking about this issue of keeping BIBFRAME and MARC in sync, we really were thinking about this conversion from BIBFRAME to MARC. But let me just ask a minute the question from the reverse side. We know that many more libraries will be working in MARC for a long time. And if we think, for instance, of the program for cooperative cataloging, that data may appear in OCLC, and then that data may be enhanced. So Right now, if we just look at share VDE as a model, that data in OCLC is converted to BibFrame, but then that original MARC data can be enhanced further. And if we were saying that the data pools should not necessarily be kept in sync, then it seems logical that the converted BibFrame data then eventually would become out of sync with the MARC, and the MARC would be richer than the BibFrame data. So it is, I think, a complicated question. So before I move on to the last question, are there any additional thoughts from the panelists about that sort of growing discontinuity between the two and the fact that the BibFrame may actually become less rich than the MARC data?
Well, actually, Philip, or the BibFrame data may become, the MARC data may become less rich than the BibFrame data. Right.
Right. It can go either way. It can go either
yes.
way.
I can just chip in that I think we have, at least in our experience, have had much easier to clean up metadata in BibFrame format than in MARC format. There are much more tools for validation and such that are readily available to developers without really understanding the MARC format. I mean, most people understand XML or JSON, so.
Great, thank you very much. So I know we only have about 5 minutes left in the panel, so why don't I go on to the last question? And that was, should linked data created by libraries be made freely available for sharing and editing? And how do you see this happening? So I just wanted to expand just a little bit. I think what is interesting, I think we all have talked about linked open data and the importance of having data be free and open, but it is also true that services that consolidate data may make enhancements to the data through reconciliation or various other services. And so then the data which they may make available has gone through processes which do cost money to be able to do. So it's I think a little bit more difficult question to think about than I may have put it into the question initially. So why don't I start this time with Alan to see what you think about data being freely available to anybody in the world.
So, I mean, at the moment, we do make some of our data freely available to anyone in the world to reuse. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So all of the metadata has a value, and somebody somewhere has been paid to create the metadata. So it may be that it's created by a cataloger working in a British library or another national bibliographic agency or in a university, but somebody's paying that cataloger to do the work. And then we also have, we pay other agencies to create metadata for us, which we then make available. And we will actually pay a sort of premium in order to license that metadata in order that we can make it available. So although the metadata might be free at the point of use, it's only possible because someone is somewhere or somebody's taxpayers are enabling that to happen. So, and in order to make the data cost-free, we may have to place some restrictions on reuse or certainly redistribution of the data. Because underlying all of this, there's a marketplace which can be significantly disrupted as a consequence of the change that we're now going through, and which might actually inhibit or limit the amount of metadata that's available to us in future if the companies that we are and collaborations that we currently depend upon are not able to be sustained financially through this transition.
Great, thank you very much. So Chiara, what are your thoughts?
We have a large amounts of bibliographic data, but over the years, I think we have focused so much on their production and high quality that we have lost sight of the ultimate goal to provide access to knowledge through the resources of libraries in order to change society. Linked data allowed us to participate in the competition for the interest and the time of our users, which is otherwise captured by something else. So we should also make our data freely available for sharing and editing. And we should move from a system in which the authority of libraries in the field of bibliographic data production is imposed to one in which it is acknowledged and recognized. Linked data is suitable for sharing data and also for providing information on the production context. We could define data editing as a methods which are halfway between a collaborative creation model and the authority creation model. I think that the wiki approach also works well in this scenario. In July 2021, WikiCite community announced the roadmap for the next generation. It officially expressed its desire to continue working on the best practices for sharing bibliographic data, including ontologies definition, developing new tools, licenses, and then the possibility, was already suggested in the Wikidata strategy of 2019, of building a Wikibase ecosystem, which is a network of Wikibase instances that share data and other capacities. And this solution combines the advantages of collective intelligence based approach with the needs of a specific domain and institution, and I guess a probably solution.
Great, thank you. And I know we're out of time, but if Life will give me just 1 minute, let me quickly ask Frederick and then Sally for their thoughts on this as well.
I will keep it quick and just want to echo a little bit of Alan's sentiments here. As a public institution funded by taxpayer money, I think it's kind of evident that we should share this freely. Of course, there are implications where you buy metadata from other entities. And the question is there, should you put more effort into the contracts and agreements to make it available? Because it's, I mean, there's not anything that says that it has to be unfree if you have a contract, so to speak. Yes.
Great, thank you. And Sally?
And just briefly, because I think everybody has really given very interesting answers, that while free data is the goal, we do have to distinguish, as you said, actually in the introduction, between service and data content. And so we quite often, we got all bound up when some institutions were trying to copyright the data and therefore charge for the data content. And restrict the use of the data content. And but it is case that the reality is that a distribution system that's storing the data, the people who do that, they have a cost, and that's a service that they are providing to people. So they should be able to charge for a service, but we have a free data notion in our community that we do not want. We want to avoid having to charge for the data itself.
Great, thank you very much. And with a great thank you to all of the panelists and presenters today in this session, let me turn it back over to Life.
Thank you, Philip. We are now at the end of our 3 days BIBFRAME workshop in Europe. And we have focused on data exchange today with and also discussion about the relation to RDA. Kevin Ford had a presentation, and I know that he presented the version 2.1, and one of the headlines was that there's a better integration with other ontologies, and he used a lot of slides to describe how there's becoming more formalization of the BIBFRAME development, and it is handled in GitHub with a 6-month cycle. And there was a panel about what role RDF can play in the transition to linked data library. There was a panel, there was many panelists, and I can't repeat all of it. There was many issues discussed, the discussion about works and hubs and opus that we have several times. One of my own reflection is that we should every time remember one thing, that nothing fits all, and no ontology handles everything. And I think in my conclusion is also that there is no need for a one-to-one relation between rules and format. I think that it can maybe be discussed, but that's my reflection. And then we have a report on a meeting in the program for cooperative cataloging about BIBFRAME data exchanged. And the interesting thing there is there's really many groups was represented. There's a very broad interest for data exchanged. And people are very focused on how to avoid silos. And conclusion, there is a core need for interchange and also for simplified MAC. There was many issues, there was many ideas, and I look forward to the summary that will be published. And then at last we have this panel discussion, and I can't take in all details from that. There was too many, and sometimes there's more questions than answers. But there is also a full understanding, and we need agreements for how to handle BIBFRAME data exchange. And we also must accept, understand there is many libraries that will be used MARC and maybe for decades. And so MARC and BIBFRAME needs to live together, but still also the conclusion is there's no possibility to have a 100% synchronization. And one of the discussion is, where will the master be? Will it be the BIBFRAME or will it be the MARC 21 records? That's a good question. Okay, we have Just Joe. That is the organizer group that had organized this event. And thanks to my colleagues for this work. And I think it's been a good work together. We have set up a working group, an organizer group for the BIBFRAME workshop in Europe next year. And as we see, there is one change. Nancy Lorimer had stepped in on Philip's seat in the organizer group. And I would like to present Nancy. She also comes, like Philip, from Stanford University Green Library. She's an associate director for metadata service and been that in 7 years. Nancy plays a key role both in linked data for production and in programs for cooperative cataloging. She's member of the BBC Policy Committee, the subcommittee on training, and she a co-chair of the Metadata Application Profiles Working Group in PCC. And she also works with the performed music ontology. And people have been attending this workshop will remember that Nancy had a presentation on the last three years of the workshops. And so Philip steps down. He has leave his position as Director for Technical and Access Services and take the role of Deputy University Librarian on Stanford University Green Library. And thanks to Philip for his great work. And I will miss you, Philip, in this work. And also thanks to all the participants. And also I just counted to 27 presenters, moderators, and panelists. Many people have been involved in this workshop and make it available to everybody. And also thanks to our host, Casalini Libri, and especially to Michelle Casalini for hosting this online event. And also many thanks to the host team, Anna Leonetti and Antonio Cordola. And just a few words about communication. There is a Twitter hashtag, so you can see what has many people have commented during the workshop. And ongoing, we have our mailing list, and I hope that there are people who are interested to follow the work we are doing according to the European workshop should sign up. We don't take everybody that I sign up for this workshop this year and just put them into the list. You have to do it by yourself. And we will have a workshop next year. For the workshop last year, we had been invited by the National Library of Hungary to come to Budapest. But as you know, the COVID situation, the pandemic had made both workshops in 2020 and 2021 online. So we hope for the next year in 2022 that we can meet in person again and we can meet each other in Budapest. And dates will be decided before end of this year. And last slide, thanks again to all. I hope you will have a nice day, a nice afternoon, a nice night, and hope to see you next year in Budapest. And we stop exactly on time. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lai.
Thanks.
Thank you.